The courtyard of Nagasaki's execution grounds falls silent on the morning of September the 10th, 1622. Over 30,000 spectators have gathered behind bamboo barriers erected by the shogunate's soldiers. They stand beneath the late summer sun, watching as 55 condemned prisoners are led in chains toward their deaths. Among them walks a samurai in his 40th year, stripped of his armour and his swords, his top knot severed in disgrace. His name is recorded in Portuguese Jesuit documents as Naito Joan. Beside him walks his son, a boy of 15 years named Paolo, whose hands are bound before him with hemp rope. They are Christians, and in the Japan of Tokugawa Ieyasu's successors, that is a crime punishable by torture and execution. But what makes this execution different from the dozens of others that will occur today is the arrangement the magistrate has offered Naito Joan. An arrangement documented in the letters of Jesuit priest João Rodrigues, who witnessed the events from a hidden vantage point and smuggled his account to Macau 3 months later. The magistrate has told Naito that if he performs one final act of loyalty to the shogun, his own death will be swift. A quick beheading, no torture, no burning. All he must do is execute his own son. Paolo will be ordered to commit seppuku, the ritual disembowelment reserved for samurai, and when the boy drives the blade across his abdomen, when the blood begins to pool on the execution platform, Naito must step forward and perform kishaku, the mercy stroke, a single cut that severs the spinal column and ends suffering. Father must behead son, and if Naito refuses, both will be subjected to anatsurushi, suspended upside down over pits filled with human excrement until they suffocate or drown in filth over the course of days. The crowd watches, the magistrate waits. Paolo kneels on the wooden platform, a short blade placed before him, and Naito Joan, war veteran who once fought at the Battle of Sekigahara, who earned his rank through 20 years of loyal service, who converted to Christianity in 1607 and baptized his children in defiance of the expulsion edicts, must now choose between faith and mercy, between his God and his son's suffering. What he chooses, and what his son whispers to him in the final moments before the blade enters flesh, is preserved in the records of the Vatican Secret Archives, and it represents the darkest chapter of Japan's persecution of Christians, a systematic campaign of psychological torture that forced fathers to become executioners, that turned family bonds into instruments of coercion, and that claimed over 280,000 lives across 2.5 centuries of suppression. This is that story. Before we examine the documented horror of Japan's Christian persecutions, if you seek true historical accounts that honor forgotten victims, subscribe to Regal Someone's Sins. To understand how a samurai father could be placed in such an impossible position, you must first understand how Christianity arrived in Japan, how it flourished for 70 years, and how it became the most brutally suppressed religion in Japanese history. On the 15th of August, 1549, a Spanish Jesuit priest named Francis Xavier stepped off a Chinese junk onto the shores of Kagoshima in southern Kyushu. He carried with him letters of introduction, religious texts translated into rudimentary Japanese, and a mission sanctioned by the Pope to bring Catholicism to the islands of Japan. What he found was a nation fractured by civil war. The Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, had been raging for over a century. Daimyo warlords battled for territory, while the imperial court in Kyoto held only symbolic power. Into this chaos, Christianity spread with astonishing speed. Why? Because the Portuguese traders who accompanied the Jesuits brought something Japan desperately wanted: Tanegashima matchlock firearms. Daimyo who converted to Christianity, or at least tolerated missionaries in their domains, gained access to European weapons technology. Within 30 years, over 200,000 Japanese had been baptized. Entire domains converted. Churches were built in Nagasaki, Kyoto, Osaka and Edo. Christian samurai rose to prominence. One, Takeyama Ukon, became a daimyo and declared his entire domain Christian. The Jesuits established seminaries. They printed books using Japan's first movable type printing press. By 1582, a delegation of 4 young Christian samurai traveled to Rome and were received by Pope Gregory XIII. Christianity in Japan seemed destined to flourish. Then the political winds shifted. In 1587, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the warlord who had unified most of Japan, issued the first Batran Suiho Rei, the edict for the expulsion of missionaries. His reasons were pragmatic. He feared Christian daimyo were becoming too powerful. He worried that loyalty to a foreign pope might supersede loyalty to Japanese rulers, and he was disturbed by reports that Portuguese traders were purchasing Japanese prisoners of war and selling them as slaves in Macau and Goa. The edict ordered all Jesuit missionaries to leave Japan within 20 days. Most ignored it. Hideyoshi, focused on his invasion of Korea, did not enforce it strictly, but in 1597 his patience ended. On February 5th of that year, 26 Christians, 6 Spanish Franciscan missionaries, 3 Japanese Jesuits, and 17 Japanese laypeople, including 3 young boys, were marched from Kyoto to Nagasaki, a journey of over 800 kilometers. On arrival, they were crucified on a hill overlooking Nagasaki Bay. Among them was Paolo Miki, a Japanese Jesuit who preached from his cross for hours before soldiers thrust spears through his body. These became known as the 26 Martyrs of Japan. Their executions were meant to terrify Christians into apostasy. Instead, they became martyrs whose story spread across Catholic Europe, inspiring thousands more conversions. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, enforcement relaxed again, but in 1600 everything changed. Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara, annihilating his rivals and establishing a shogunate that would rule Japan for 268 years. Initially, Ieyasu tolerated Christians. He valued trade with the Portuguese and Spanish, but his advisors warned him that Christianity was incompatible with the rigid social hierarchy the Tokugawa Shogunate required. In Japanese feudal society, loyalty was absolute. A samurai owed his life to his daimyo. A daimyo owed his life to the shogun. The emperor, though powerless, was divine. But Christians claimed ultimate loyalty belonged to God, not temporal rulers. They refused to participate in Shinto rituals. They rejected ancestor worship, a cornerstone of Japanese family structure. And most dangerously, they created horizontal bonds of solidarity across class lines, peasants and samurai worshipping together, calling each other brother and sister. In 1614, Ieyasu signed the Christian Expulsion Edict. All missionaries were to be deported or executed. All Japanese Christians were to recant or die. The machinery of persecution began, and it would not stop for 259 years. What follows is the story of how that persecution escalated from execution to systematic psychological torture, how families became weapons, and how faith became a crime punishable by the most horrifying deaths ever devised. The persecution began with a test, a simple, elegant test that separated the faithful from the fearful. It was called fumi-e, picture trampling. Shogunate officials would place a bronze or wooden plaque on the ground engraved with an image of Christ or the Virgin Mary. Citizens suspected of Christian sympathies were ordered to step on it. Those who refused were arrested. Those who hesitated were watched. Those who trampled the image without hesitation were free to go. At first, most Christians refused. Arrests surged. Prisons in Nagasaki, Kyoto, and Edo overflowed. In 1619, 55 Christians were burned alive in Kyoto. In 1622, the year of Naito Joan's execution, 120 Christians were martyred in Nagasaki alone. But the shogunate quickly realized that martyrdom was backfiring. Public executions created heroes, crowds gathered. Some converts stood firmer in their faith after witnessing courage on the scaffold. The shogunate needed a new strategy. In 1629, they found it. Takanaka Uneme, the magistrate of Nagasaki, developed a philosophy, Korobi Batrin, making them fall. Rather than execute Christians quickly, create conditions so unbearable that they would apostatize to end their suffering. And rather than target individuals, target families. Make faith a weapon against those you love. The first method was tsurushi, the hanging torture. Victims were stripped naked, bound with ropes, and suspended upside down from a gallows. Their heads were enclosed in wooden boxes or pits filled with human waste to prevent them from seeing or breathing easily. A small incision was made in the temple to prevent blood pressure from causing immediate death. The goal was not to kill, but to prolong suffering for days. Victims who agreed to apostatize were immediately released. Those who refused typically died after 3 to 7 days, but family pressure proved even more effective. Shogunate records, preserved in the Tokugawa Jikki, true records of the Tokugawa, document a systematic policy implemented in 1632, Renza, collective punishment. If one family member refused to apostatize, the entire family would be arrested. Wives would be forced to watch husbands tortured. Children would be placed in pits while parents listened to their screams. And samurai, who lived by the code of Bushido and valued family honor above all, faced the cruelest choice: apostatize and save your family, or watch them die because of your faith. Among those arrested in 1631 was a samurai named Naito Joan. Historical records preserved in Jesuit correspondence describe him as a veteran of the Battle of Sekigahara, where he fought for Tokugawa Ieyasu's Eastern Coalition. For that service, he had been granted a modest fief in Hizen province, not far from Nagasaki. He converted to Christianity around 1607, baptized by a Portuguese Jesuit whose name is lost to history. By 1620, his entire household, his wife, his 3 children, and his servants had converted. When the 1614 edict was proclaimed, Naito faced his first choice. Several samurai he knew had apostatized publicly, trampling the fumie and attending Buddhist ceremonies to prove their renunciation. They kept their lands, they kept their status, but in private some continued practicing Christianity in secret, becoming kakure kirishitan, hidden Christians. Naito refused this compromise. He attended Mass openly when Jesuit priests secretly visited Hizen. He taught his children the rosary. When shogunate inspectors arrived in 1629 to conduct fumie tests in his domain, Naito and his entire family refused. They were arrested on the 3rd of March, 1631. Naito, his wife Maria, his eldest son Paolo, age 15, his daughter Lucia, age 12, and his youngest son Miguel, age 8, were transported in caged carts to Nagasaki. There, they were imprisoned in the magistrate's jail, a complex of wooden cells built along the harbour where prisoners awaited judgment. For 18 months, they remained in captivity. During that time, Magistrate Takanaka Uneme visited Naito repeatedly. He offered him the same deal he offered other samurai: apostatize, perform the fumie, and you and your family will be released. Your lands will be restored. Your honour will remain intact. All you must do is step on an image. It is only wood. It is only bronze. Your God will understand. Naito refused. His wife refused. His children refused. Then in August of 1632, Takanaka changed his approach. He separated the family. He brought Naito into an interrogation chamber and presented him with a new offer, an offer documented in the letters of João Rodrigues, who interviewed survivors after the martyrdoms. Takanaka told Naito that his faith was costing his children their lives, that his stubbornness was sentencing his daughter to torture, his youngest son to burning. But there was a way to end their suffering, a way to give them mercy. Execute them yourself. The psychological torture devised by Takanaka Uneme and his successors represents one of the most sophisticated campaigns of religious persecution ever documented. Unlike the Roman persecutions of early Christians, which relied on spectacle and public martyrdom, the Japanese approach sought to break faith privately, to turn love into a weapon, and to make families the instruments of their own destruction. The method was implemented systematically across domains where Christians had been identified. The records of the Shimabara Rebellion archives, preserved in Nagasaki's 26 Martyrs Museum, describe the process in bureaucratic detail. When a Christian family was arrested, they were separated immediately. Fathers were held in one facility, mothers in another, children in a third. Interrogations began with the father. He would be presented with the fumii and given a choice: trample the image and your family will be released. Refuse and they will be tortured in front of you. Most samurai, trained since childhood in stoicism and pain tolerance, believed they could endure physical torture themselves. But watching their children suffer was different. Magistrates understood this. They began interrogations not with torture, but with simple deprivation. Children were denied food. Fathers could hear their cries from adjacent cells. After days of this, the father would be brought into the cell where his children were held. He would see their emaciated bodies. He would be told, trample the image and they will be fed. Refuse and the hunger continues. If the father still refused, escalation began. Stage 1. Witnessing torture of spouse. The father would be forced to watch his wife subjected to mizuzeme, water torture. The victim was bound to a ladder-like structure, tilted backward at an angle. A cloth was placed over the face and water was poured continuously over the nose and mouth, creating the sensation of drowning. The torture could continue for hours. Between sessions, the magistrate would ask the husband, "Will you trample the image now?" If he refused, the torture resumed. Jesuit records describe one samurai, identified only as Thomas of Bungo, who watched his wife subjected to mizuzimi for 6 hours. When she finally lost consciousness, the magistrate turned to Thomas and said, "She will die if you do not save her." Thomas, weeping, apostatized. He trampled the fumii. His wife was revived. But 3 days later, Thomas hanged himself in his cell. The magistrate's report, preserved in Shogunate archives, notes this outcome with no commentary. The goal had been achieved. The Christian had renounced his faith. Stage 2. Torture of children. If witnessing spousal torture did not break the father, children became the next leverage point. The method varied based on the child's age. For infants and toddlers, the torture was psychological rather than physical. The child would be held before the father, and a blade would be placed against the infant's throat. The magistrate would ask, "Is your God worth more than this child's life?" If the father refused to apostatize, the blade would press deeper, drawing blood but not cutting the artery. The infant would scream. The father would be asked again. For older children, physical torture was applied directly. The most common method was tsurushi, the same hanging torture used on adults but modified. Children as young as 7 were suspended upside down over the pits of excrement. Because their smaller bodies could not withstand the same duration as adults, they typically lost consciousness within hours. Some died within a day. The father would be brought to watch. He would be told, "This will continue until you trample the image." The Jesuit priest Cristóvão Ferreira, who himself apostatized after 6 hours of tsurushi torture in 1633, wrote in his later confessional letters, "I heard the screams of children subjected to tortures their small bodies could not endure. I saw fathers weep as their sons begged them to make the pain stop. And I understood then why so many samurai, men who would gladly die for their lord, broke when their children suffered for their faith." Stage 3. The executioner's choice. If stages 1 and 2 failed to produce apostasy, the magistrate implemented the final psychological weapon, forced complicity. This method was reserved almost exclusively for samurai, who were trained in the use of swords and who understood the mechanics of execution. The father would be brought before the magistrate and presented with a new offer. His children would be sentenced to death. This was now inevitable. But the manner of death could be chosen. If the father apostatized and served as the executioner, his children would die by beheading, a swift, honorable death by samurai standards. The father would perform kaishaku, the mercy stroke, during his child's seppuku, if the child was old enough, or simply behead them directly, if they were younger. After the execution, the father himself would be killed quickly, but if the father refused, the children would be subjected to haritsuke, crucifixion, followed by yaridetsuku, piercing with spears, a slow death over hours or days. The father would be forced to watch, then he himself would be burned alive. The archives contain records of at least 12 documented cases where samurai fathers accepted this offer between 1622 and 1638. The most detailed account is that of Naito Joan and his son Paulo. According to João Rodrigues's letters smuggled to Macau in December 1632, Naito was brought before Magistrate Takenaka in late August of that year. His wife Maria had died 2 weeks earlier from dysentery contracted in the filthy prison conditions. His daughter Lucia had been sent to a separate facility for women and girls. Only his 2 sons remained with him. Takenaka presented the choice. Paulo, the eldest at 15, was of age to perform seppuku. If Naito agreed to serve as kaishaku and behead Paulo after the disembowelment, then Miguel, the 8-year-old, would be beheaded quickly as well. Both sons would die with honor. Naito himself would then be beheaded. 3 swift deaths. Minimal suffering, but if Naito refused, all 3 would be crucified and burned. Miguel would watch his father and brother die first. Naito asked for 1 night to pray. Takenaka granted it. That night, in the cell he shared with Paulo and Miguel, Naito explained the choice to his sons. What followed is preserved in Rodrigues's account, based on testimony from a guard who overheard their conversation and later converted to Christianity himself, fleeing to Manila. Paulo told his father, "If I must die, let me die as a samurai. I will perform seppuku, and I ask that you, father, grant me the mercy of kaishaku. This is not betrayal, this is love." Miguel, 8 years old, said, "I am afraid of fire. Please, father, do not let them burn me." Naito wept through the night. By dawn, he had made his decision. On September 10th, 1632, Naito Joan and his 2 sons were led into the execution courtyard. The execution grounds at Nagasaki on September the 10th, 1632, held 55 condemned Christians. Most were bound and awaiting death by burning or beheading, but one wooden platform, elevated above the others, had been prepared specifically for Naito and his sons. The magistrate had ordered this execution to be conducted in full view of the crowd. It was meant to serve as both a deterrent and a demonstration. Even samurai loyalty, even paternal love, could be broken by the machinery of persecution. 30,000 spectators watched from behind bamboo barriers. Among them, hidden in the crowd, were several Christians who had apostatized publicly but remained faithful in secret. Kakure Kirishitan. One of these witnesses, a merchant named Pedro Kasui, later gave testimony to Jesuits in Manila. His account was incorporated into Rodrigues's letter and is preserved in the Vatican Archives under the classification Fondo Boncompagni Ludovisi, manuscript 337, folios 68 through 72. According to Kasui's testimony, Naito and his sons were led onto the platform at mid-morning. Paulo walked steadily, his face composed. Miguel trembled, but did not cry out. Naito's face, Kasui reported, was like stone, empty of all expression, save a terrible grief that no words can convey. The magistrate read the charges in Japanese. Refusal to renounce the foreign religion, refusal to perform fumi-e, defiance of the shogun's edicts. Then he announced the sentence: death by beheading for the father and eldest son, carried out by the father's own hand. The younger son would be beheaded by the magistrate's official executioner. But before the executions, Takanaka Unime addressed the crowd. He explained that Naito had been given many opportunities to save his family. He emphasized that this death was Naito's choice, the result of his stubbornness and misplaced faith. He wanted the crowd to see this not as persecution, but as the natural consequence of disobedience. Then the executions began. Paolo was instructed to kneel at the center of the platform. A short blade, a tanto, was placed before him. In traditional seppuku, the ritual would involve elaborate preparation. The condemned would compose a death poem, dress in white, drink sake. But this was not a traditional seppuku. This was punishment disguised as ritual. Paolo was given no time to prepare. He knelt, wrapped a cloth around the blade's handle, and lifted it with both hands. Kasui's testimony describes what happened next. The boy looked at his father and said, in a voice loud enough that many of us heard, "I forgive you, father, and I will wait for you in paradise." Then he placed the blade against his abdomen, just below the ribs on the left side, and drew it across to the right. His hands did not shake. Blood soaked his clothing. He gasped, but did not cry out. At this moment, Naito was handed his own sword. A katana confiscated when he was arrested, now returned for this single purpose. He stepped behind Paolo. The boy bowed his head forward, exposing the back of his neck. According to Bushido tradition, the kaishaku must sever the neck with one stroke, leaving a small strip of flesh so the head does not roll away. It is considered an act of mercy, a demonstration of skill and respect. Naito raised the blade. Kasui reported that Naito's hands shook violently. He stood frozen for several seconds. The magistrate shouted at him to proceed. Naito closed his eyes, whispered something. Kasui believed it was a prayer and brought the sword down. The cut was clean. Paolo's suffering ended instantly. Immediately after, the magistrate's executioner stepped forward and beheaded Miguel, who had been forced to watch his brother's death. The 8-year-old died without performing seppuku as he was too young for the ritual. Then Naito Joan knelt in the same spot where his son had died. The magistrate asked him one final time, "Will you trample the fumie now and live?" Naito's response is recorded in Rodriguez's letter. He said, "I have already trampled on my soul. There is nothing left to save." He was beheaded within seconds. The executions of September 10th, 1632 were part of the Genna Persecution, the most intensive phase of anti-Christian suppression in Japanese history. But they were far from the end. In fact, they marked an escalation. The shogunate had learned that psychological torture, forcing fathers to become executioners, was more effective than simple martyrdom at breaking Christian communities. Between 1632 and 1638, records suggest that at least 12 additional cases of father-son forced executions occurred in Nagasaki, Kyoto, and Edo. The documentation is fragmentary, as many Jesuit letters were intercepted and destroyed by shogunate censors, but surviving correspondence from priests who escaped to Macau and Manila provides names and details. One case involved a samurai, identified as Michael Nakashima, who beheaded his 2 sons in 1634. Another involved Antonio of Higo, who beheaded his son but refused to apostatize afterward, leading to his execution by burning. In 1637, the practice spread beyond samurai. A peasant Christian in Shimabara was ordered to stone his own daughter to death. He complied, then killed himself immediately after. But the most significant event that exposed the full horror of Japan's persecution came in 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion. In the Shimabara Peninsula and the nearby Amakusa Islands, tens of thousands of Christian peasants and ronin, masterless samurai, revolted against crushing taxation and religious persecution. They fortified themselves in Hara Castle and withstood a siege by over 100,000 shogunate troops for 4 months. When the castle finally fell in April 1638, every rebel inside, estimated at 37,000 people, including women and children, was executed. After Shimabara, the shogunate concluded that Christianity had to be eradicated completely. The policy of forced apostasy through family torture intensified. But something else happened. The documentation stopped. In 1639, the shogunate expelled all remaining Portuguese traders and sealed Japan's borders. No foreign missionaries could enter. No letters could be smuggled out. Christianity went underground, becoming Kakura Kirishitan, hidden Christianity, practiced in secret for the next 235 years. It was not until 1865, after Japan was forced to reopen to the West, that the hidden Christians revealed themselves. When French Catholic missionaries built the Ura Church in Nagasaki, a group of villagers approached and whispered, "We are Christian. We have kept the faith." Historians estimate that roughly 30,000 kakura kirishitan had survived, passing down prayers and rituals through oral tradition, hiding crosses inside Buddhist statues, worshipping in secret. And in their oral histories, passed from generation to generation, were the stories of the martyrs, the fathers who chose their children suffering over their faith, the sons who forgave their fathers for beheading them, the families who chose death together rather than apostasy. Among those stories, preserved in fragmented form and written down in the late 19th century, was the story of Naito Joan and his son Paolo. The persecution of Christians in Japan officially ended in 1873 when the Meiji government, under pressure from Western powers, lifted the ban on Christianity. But the psychological scars endured for generations. Families that had practiced kakura kirishitan for 235 years found it difficult to reconcile their hidden traditions with the Catholic Church's official teachings. Some returned to mainstream Catholicism. Others remained kakure, maintaining their unique blend of Christian and Buddhist practices. In 1867, Pope Pius IX beatified the 205 martyrs of Japan, a group that included many of the Christians executed during the Genna Persecution. Among them were Naito Joan, his sons Paolo and Miguel, and his wife Maria. The Catholic Church recognized their deaths as martyrdom, their suffering as witness to faith. But the legacy of forced family executions remains deeply troubling even within theological discussions. Was Naito Joan a martyr? Or did he, by executing his son, commit a sin so grave that it negated his faith? Catholic theologians have debated this for over a century. Some argue that Naito acted out of mercy, granting his son a swift death to spare him prolonged torture. Others argue that participating in evil, even under duress, constitutes cooperation with evil. What is not debatable is the cruelty of the system that placed him in that position. The Tokugawa Shogunate's persecution of Christians represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated campaigns of religious suppression in history. Unlike the Roman persecutions, which sought public spectacle, or the Spanish Inquisition, which sought theological purity, the Japanese approach sought total psychological collapse. It turned love into torture. It made fathers into executioners. It forced parents to choose between faith and their children's suffering. Modern historians estimate that between 280,000 and 300,000 Christians were martyred in Japan between 1597 and 1873. The majority died during the Genna Persecution, 1622 to 1632, and the aftermath of the Shimabara Rebellion, 1638 to 1640. The methods of execution range from beheading and burning to the specialized tortures like tsurushi, mizuzime, and anatsurushi. In Nagasaki today, the 26 Martyrs Museum preserves the records, letters, and artifacts from the persecution. Among the exhibits is a replica of a fumia plaque, worn smooth by the thousands of feet that trampled it over 2 centuries. There are letters from Jesuit missionaries describing the tortures in clinical detail. There are lists of names, martyrs, apostates, and those who disappeared into the hidden Christian underground. And there is a painting created in the 19th century by a Japanese Catholic artist depicting the execution of Naito Joan and his sons. In the painting, Paolo kneels with the blade against his abdomen. Naito stands behind him, sword raised, tears streaming down his face. And Miguel, small and terrified, watches from the side awaiting his turn. The painting is titled simply, "The Mercy of the Father." This has been the documented case of Naito Joan and the systematic persecution of Christians in Tokugawa, Japan, preserved in Jesuit correspondence, Vatican archives, and the records of the Shimabara Rebellion. If you found this account valuable, share it with others who seek to understand the full scope of religious persecution across history. These stories are not easy. They disturb, they haunt, but they must be told. At Regal Sins, we examine documented atrocities from every corner of the medieval and early modern world, always grounded in archival evidence, always honouring the victims, and always asking the difficult questions about power, faith, and human cruelty. Next week, we return to medieval Europe to examine a case from the Inquisition archives, the systematic torture of an entire village in 13th century France, documented in trial records that have only recently been translated. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. How do you reconcile faith with such suffering? Was Naito Joan a martyr or a man broken by evil? These are not simple questions, and we want to hear your perspectives. If this work matters to you, support us on Patreon so we can continue researching forgotten histories. Until next time, remember the lost, honour the victims, and never forget that the cruelest weapons in history were often not swords or fire, but the bonds of love turned into instruments of torture. I am your host. This is Regal Sins. Thank you for bearing witness.